Somewhere in Africa, roughly 300,000 years ago, a woman is grinding red pigment between two stones. She works in silence. The ochre dust falls into a shallow hollow, worn smooth by generations of the same motion. She is not doing this for food. She is not doing this to survive the night. She is doing it because something inside her needs to. Because the color means something that cannot be explained in the language of calories or shelter or danger. She has never heard of Egypt. She has no idea that a civilization will one day build monuments in the desert that people will still be looking at 250,000 years after her death. She does not know that she is the beginning of something. She just knows the red is important. That woman is your ancestor. And her story is the one we almost never tell. Or for everything we call history, the rise and fall of empires, the names carved into stone, the dates you memorized in school, covers approximately the last 5,000 years of human existence. 5,000 years sounds like a long time until you hold it against the full span of what we are. Modern humans, anatomically identical to you and to that woman with the ochre, have existed for over 300,000 years. What that means is that everything you were ever taught about human history represents less than 2% of the actual story. The other 98% happened in the dark, before writing, before cities, before anyone thought to leave a record. And it is not a blank. It is not nothing. It is a vast, intricate, almost entirely forgotten chapter of what it means to be human. And the fragments of it we are slowly recovering are strange and extraordinary, enough to change everything you think you know about where you came from. The oldest fossils of anatomically modern humans were found at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. When the first analyses came back, researchers expected a date of perhaps 200,000 years. The actual date was 315,000 years. The discovery did not just push back the origin of our species by 100 millennia. It shattered the idea that modern humans emerged suddenly in one place and spread outward in a single wave. Similar fossils of comparable age were turning up in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in Kenya. Not one origin point, but multiple populations across an entire continent, all developing that distinctive modern skull, that high rounded cranium, that particular arrangement of face and chin that separates us from every other human species that ever lived. Our beginning was not a single birth. It was something more like a continental conversation. Populations separated by grasslands and deserts and mountain ranges, occasionally meeting, occasionally mixing, all gradually becoming the same kind of creature. Those creatures had the same brains you have, the same neural architecture, the same processing capacity, the same potential for abstract thought and language and art and everything that we think of as distinctly human. But for the first 100,000 years or more after they appeared, the archaeological record looks almost unchanged from what other human species were producing. The same basic stone tools. It had the same patterns of movement and subsistence. Something was there in potential that had not yet fully expressed itself. Or perhaps something was there all along that we simply cannot see, preserved in materials that do not survive, in behaviors that leave no trace in rock and bone. The first hints of something different begin appearing around 200,000 years ago. At Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of Africa, archaeologists found systematic evidence of ochre processing, of careful collection and grinding of the mineral into pigment. That alone is significant. Ochre has no nutritional value. It cannot make a spear point sharper or a hide softer. The only explanation that makes sense is that it was being used for something symbolic, for marking the body or marking objects with meaning that went beyond the purely functional. Not long after, shell beads begin appearing at sites across the continent, tiny perforated shells clearly strung for wearing. These are not decorations in the casual modern sense, they are statements. When you put on a necklace, you are declaring something about who you are and what group you belong to. You are using an object to carry meaning that exceeds its physical existence. That is abstract thought. That is the beginning of everything. Then, around 100,000 years ago, the evidence gets harder to dismiss. People are burying their dead with care, not just covering bodies, but positioning them, orienting them, placing objects alongside them. In a cave in Israel, 2 bodies lie on their sides, limbs arranged with evident intention. Someone dug those graves. Someone put those bodies in them and chose how they would rest. Think about what that act requires. You need to understand that the person is gone in a way that is permanent. You need to feel something about that permanence that moves you to do more than simply walk away. You need to have some concept, however inchoate, of what lies beyond the moment of death. Those graves are the first evidence we have of human beings confronting their own mortality and responding with ritual, with meaning. They were asking the questions that have never stopped being asked, and they were answering them the only way that was available, in the language of gesture and symbol, in the careful placement of a body in earth, in the color of ochre spread over the dead. The world these people inhabited was not empty. Between 300,000 and 40,000 years ago, the Earth was home to at least 5 different human species, all living simultaneously, all making tools, all using fire, all capable of sophisticated behavior. The Neanderthals had Europe and Western Asia. They were manufacturing complex tools, hunting megafauna that outweighed them many times over, burying their dead, possibly making pigment. They were not brutes. They were humans in the fullest sense of that word, shaped differently by a different evolutionary path, but meeting the world with the same essential equipment of a large brain and an opposable thumb and the capacity for cooperation. The Denisovans controlled vast stretches of Asia. We know them almost entirely through their DNA, extracted from a handful of bones found in a cave in Siberia, and that DNA has turned up in modern populations from Tibet to New Guinea. They existed across thousands of miles and thousands of years, and they left traces in us even though they left almost nothing in the rock record. There were others too. Homo naledi in South Africa, with its strange mixture of ancient and modern features. The small-bodied Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, barely a meter tall but capable of making sophisticated stone tools. Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. All of these species were alive when our direct ancestors were alive. All of them were eventually gone. The question of why we survived when they did not is one that archaeologists have been arguing about for generations without reaching a definitive answer. It was not brain size. Neanderthals had larger brains than we did. It was not tool-making ability. Multiple species were producing tools of comparable sophistication. It may have been social organization, the ability to maintain larger and more flexible networks of people, connected by kinship and alliance across greater distances, networks that allowed innovations to spread and accumulate rather than being confined to a single small band. It may have been language, not just communication, but true syntax, the ability to express not only what is, but what was and what might be, to share complex information about the past and the future with precision. If our ancestors developed even a slight advantage in the complexity of what they could say to each other, that advantage would have compounded over generations into something enormous. Or it may have been luck. The fossil record is full of species that were spectacularly successful until suddenly they were not. We should hold our survival with some humility. It was not guaranteed. What we know is that by around 70,000 years ago, something had shifted. The archaeological record from Africa begins to look dramatically different. Elaborate tools, materials traded across hundreds of miles, shell beads with consistent stylistic choices that speak to shared cultural identity, ochre engravings with repeated geometric patterns that suggest a symbolic system. And around 60,000 years ago, a small group of people did something no human population had done before. They walked out of Africa, and they did not stop. The route they took was almost certainly coastal, following the shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula, and then eastward along the coast of South Asia. This makes sense for people who had been living on the African coast, learning to exploit marine resources. Shellfish and fish and seabirds do not require you to reinvent your entire knowledge base when you move to a new beach. The basic principles carry. And they moved fast in evolutionary terms. 5 to 10 kilometers per generation does not sound like much, but over 1,000 generations it is enough to cross half the world. Genetic analysis suggests that the descendants of those first migrants reached Australia within about 5,000 years of leaving Africa. Australia. Think about what that required. Even at the low sea levels of the last ice age, reaching Australia meant crossing stretches of open ocean. Multiple crossings. Some of them over 90 kilometers of open water, out of sight of land, navigating by stars and currents and the flight paths of birds. They were building boats capable of carrying families and supplies across 90 kilometers of ocean 65,000 years ago. That is not a small thing. That is not the behavior of a species barely scraping by. That is deliberate, planned, technically demanding exploration of the unknown. And when they arrived in Australia, they did not simply survive. They thrived. Aboriginal Australians developed sophisticated fire management practices that shaped the ecology of an entire continent, creating and maintaining grasslands and habitat mosaics that increased the productivity of the land for tens of thousands of years. They built trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. They developed kinship systems of extraordinary complexity that governed relationships and obligations across enormous distances. They mapped the continent in story and song, encoding geographical and ecological knowledge in oral traditions that were maintained with such precision that some of them contain accurate descriptions of coastlines that were submerged by rising seas more than 10,000 years ago. These are memories older than any written text, older than Mesopotamia, older than the first scratches of cuneiform on clay. They are the oldest surviving records of human observation, preserved in the most durable container ever invented, which is the human voice, trained on the human ear. Back on the Asian mainland, other branches of that original out-of-Africa migration were moving in different directions. Some went north and west into the Middle East, where they encountered Neanderthals. The genetic record tells us they did not simply displace them, or they interbred with them. Modern humans of European and Asian descent carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA, the legacy of those encounters woven into every cell of their bodies. Other groups moved further east into China and Southeast Asia and encountered the Denisovans, and again the ancient mixing left its mark. Modern Melanesians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Some Tibetan populations carry a specific Denisovan genetic variant that helps their bodies process oxygen at high altitude. A piece of ancient adaptive wisdom transferred between species tens of thousands of years ago that is still doing its work in living bodies today. We are not a pure lineage. We are a braided stream, a layered record of every meeting and every mixing and every exchange that happened in the long dark before history began. Around 40,000 years ago, modern humans reached Europe. The Neanderthals had been there for hundreds of thousands of years, had endured ice ages, had hunted woolly rhinoceros and mammoth, had developed their own tool technologies and buried their own dead. Within about 5,000 years of our ancestors' arrival, they were gone. Not necessarily through direct violence, though conflict certainly occurred. More likely through competitive exclusion, through the slow arithmetic of population dynamics, in which a group that can extract slightly more from the same landscape eventually pushes out the group that cannot keep pace. The Neanderthals were magnificent survivors. But something about what our ancestors brought with them, some combination of cognitive flexibility and social scale and technological innovation, proved decisive. By 40,000 years ago, they existed only in our DNA. The Europe that modern humans moved into was a strange and magnificent world. Ice sheets covered Scandinavia and most of Britain. Woolly mammoths walked what would become the French countryside. Cave lions prowled the grasslands of Germany. The climate was brutal and unstable, alternating between periods of intense cold and brief warming intervals, with a volatility that modern climate seems tame beside. Your ancestors had to invent solutions to problems no human population had ever faced before, and they did so with stone tools and animal skins and fire and the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of thousands of years of human experience. They invented tailored clothing, fitted garments cut from multiple skins and stitched with needles of bone so fine that modern craftspeople cannot replicate them. They built houses from mammoth bones in the treeless steppes of Eastern Europe, structures engineered to withstand winter winds and require the remains of dozens of individual animals to construct. They developed fire management techniques that could burn bone when wood was scarce, that could heat a shelter dug into frozen ground to temperatures that kept families alive through winters that would kill an unprotected person in hours. These are not the solutions of a primitive people barely hanging on. These are the solutions of an extraordinarily capable species, meeting an extraordinarily difficult world with intelligence and ingenuity and cooperation. And in the deep interior of the earth, in caves that wind back hundreds of feet from any entrance, far beyond the reach of daylight, they made art. The cave at Chauvet in southern France was discovered in 1994, when explorers squeezed through a narrow gap in the rock and found themselves in a gallery that had been sealed for perhaps 25,000 years. The animals on the walls stopped them. Lions, depicted with a confidence and a movement that no modern observer can look at without recognizing as mastery. Rhinoceros charging, their horns overlapping to suggest a herd in motion. Cave bears rendered with attention to posture and weight and the specific way that heavy animals carry themselves. The artists who made these images understood their subjects not as symbols, but as living creatures, and they understood how to translate that living presence onto stone. They were using shading, blending charcoal with their fingers to create depth and volume. They were using the natural contours of the cave wall, letting a curve in the rock become a shoulder, letting a protrusion become a head turning. The paintings are dated to approximately 36,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza is 4,500 years old. Chauvet is 8 times older than the pyramids. At Lascaux in the Dordogne, discovered in 1940, when a teenager's dog fell through a hole in the ground, the gallery is extraordinary in a different register. Where Chauvet feels primal and dark, Lascaux feels almost ceremonial. The Hall of the Bulls, the axial gallery with its procession of horses and cattle, the deep recesses where the art becomes stranger and more difficult to interpret. The horses here have been analyzed in detail, and the technique is astonishing. Multiple pigments, ground from different minerals and mixed to different consistencies, applied in layers to achieve effects of shadow and light. Scaffolding was built to reach the high ceilings. Lamps were made from stone hollows filled with animal fat and wickered with moss or lichen, producing the thin guttering light that was the only illumination. Someone lay on their back on a wooden platform 17,000 years ago and painted a running horse on the ceiling above them. And it is beautiful. Not accidentally beautiful, not beautifully primitive. Beautiful in the way that things made by people who knew exactly what they were doing are beautiful. The question of why is one that has never been fully answered. The old theory of hunting magic, to paint the animal to capture it, accounts for some of the art, but breaks down against the specific choices the artist made. At Chauvet, the walls are dominated by dangerous carnivores, lions and bears and rhinoceros that were not being hunted for food. The archaeological record at these sites shows that the people who used them were largely eating reindeer and horses, which appear far less often in the paintings than their role as prey would suggest if the art were simply about hunting. Some researchers think the caves were ritual spaces, places where initiations were conducted, where shamanic practitioners entered altered states and made contact with other orders of reality. The deepest chambers, reached only after long difficult climbs through narrow passages, may have been sites of deliberate ordeal, places where the difficulty of arrival was itself part of the meaning. Imagine being an adolescent 30,000 years ago, crawling through absolute darkness for an hour, squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for your body, finally emerging into a hidden chamber where someone holds up a lamp and the walls explode with animal life. That is not a casual experience. That is transformation. There is another possibility. The simplest one. They made the art because something in them needed to make it, because the horse running in their mind demanded to be made visible, because beauty was real to them and they could not leave it unexpressed. We do not ask why Rembrandt painted or why Shakespeare wrote. We understand without explanation that human beings make art because art is one of the ways we are most fully ourselves. Those people in the caves were human beings with the same inner world you carry. The impulse is not mysterious. It is familiar. They also made music. Bone flutes have been found at sites in Germany dating to roughly 40,000 years ago. These are not simple whistles. They are sophisticated instruments with multiple finger holes precisely positioned to produce specific notes. The Swabian Duraflutes are made from vulture bone and mammoth ivory, and they work. You can play them today. There were songs 40,000 years ago that we will never hear. Melodies that rose and fell in firelit caves and then vanished into the silence of Ice Age nights. But the instruments survived, and they tell us that those people were not just surviving. They were singing, and there were hands. Across every part of the world where people went, watching on cave walls from France to Indonesia to Argentina, there are handprints. The technique is consistent across tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles. Place your hand flat against the rock, blow pigment around it, and what remains is the negative space of your palm and fingers, a ghost, a silhouette, a statement in the most direct language possible. Touch one of those prints with your own hand. Place your palm where their palm rested, and you are connected to a specific individual across a span of time that our minds genuinely cannot hold. Small hands, probably women or adolescents. Hands with missing fingers. A print in a cave in Argentina where an adult and a child place their hands side by side, next to each other. Perhaps a parent and a child, both pressing their palms against the same stone on the same day. They were saying something. The simplest thing. I was here. I existed. This is proof. Beyond the art, the lost world of our ancestors before farming holds technologies and knowledge systems that took our species hundreds of thousands of years to develop, and that vanished almost without trace when the ways of life that carried them were disrupted. Consider what a skilled hunter-gatherer actually knew. The plants of their territory, hundreds of species, their edible parts and their toxic parts, the season and the preparation method, and the signs that distinguished a good specimen from a dangerous one, the difference between a plant that would heal a wound and a plant that looked identical but would cause one. The modern ethnobotanists who have spent their careers studying traditional plant knowledge in living cultures find themselves confronted with pharmacological systems of extraordinary depth and precision. Willow bark for fever and pain because it contains the compound we now call aspirin, specific molds from certain conditions, antibiotic in their effect, plants that induced labor and plants that eased it and plants that ended a pregnancy that had become dangerous. This was not superstition. This was pharmacology accumulated through centuries of careful observation and bitter experimentation. Someone ate the wrong thing and suffered. Someone found the preparation that neutralized the toxin. Someone discovered the combination that worked and passed it to their daughter, who passed it to hers. It was science, or just conducted without laboratories or journals, conducted in the only medium that was available, which was human memory and human voice. The navigation knowledge was equally extraordinary. The Polynesian peoples who colonized the remote Pacific islands over the last 3,500 years developed ways of reading the ocean that allowed them to cross 4,000 kilometers of open water to reach Hawaii, to find Easter Island, a speck of rock in the largest empty stretch of ocean on Earth. They read star paths memorized in sequences of hundreds of stars and their seasonal positions. They read wave patterns, feeling with their bodies the way that long ocean swells interacted with the presence of land beyond the horizon. They read the behavior of birds and clouds and the color and temperature of the water. These were not tricks or lucky guesses. They were the accumulated navigational knowledge of a civilization that had been solving the problem of open ocean travel for generations, refined and tested and passed down in songs that were themselves navigation charts, the stars and swells encoded in lyric so that they would not be forgotten. That same capacity for detailed environmental knowledge, for reading a landscape the way we read a text, was operating across all the human populations of the deep past. Hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari could look at a patch of apparently featureless sand and identify the animal that had crossed it. How long ago? What speed? What direction? What state of health? They could track a wounded animal for 2 days and find it. They could navigate across hundreds of kilometers of terrain using a mental map of landmarks and seasonal signs so detailed that it functioned as a reliable guide through conditions that would leave a modern person disoriented within an hour. They could walk into an unfamiliar forest and within a day begin identifying the productive food sources, the dangerous species, the patterns of animal movement that indicated where water was. This was not intuition. This was trained skill, built on the foundation of knowledge accumulated over many generations and transmitted with the same seriousness and rigor that we bring to training surgeons and engineers. The social architecture of these small bands was radically different from anything most modern people experience. Typically, 20 to 50 people, moving across a territory that might cover hundreds of square kilometers, connected to neighboring bands by kinship ties and trade relationships and shared ceremonial life. The social structure was profoundly egalitarian, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. You cannot accumulate material wealth when you are moving every few weeks. You cannot maintain dominance over others when survival depends on universal cooperation. Leadership existed, but it was fluid, situational, earned by demonstrated competence in the relevant domain and not transferable to other domains. The best hunter did not give orders about healing. The most skilled healer did not direct the hunt. Authority was narrow and contingent, and the social pressure against anyone attempting to claim more than their share was intense and effective. Anthropologists studying the few remaining hunter-gatherer groups that survived into the modern era have documented elaborate social mechanisms: ridicule, refusal to share, temporary expulsion, for managing individuals who attempted to accumulate status or resources beyond what the group considered appropriate. Sharing was not charity. It was mathematics. You kill a large animal. You cannot eat it all before it spoils. You share with the entire band, and when someone else makes a kill, they share with you. The sharing economy was not a moral achievement. It was the only rational strategy in a world without refrigeration or storage, and it produced a kind of material security that is genuinely difficult to replicate in its absence. Anthropologists who have lived with hunter-gatherer groups consistently note the psychological ease with which material needs are met, the absence of the anxious hoarding and competitive accumulation that characterize modern economic life. The people who study these groups call this the original affluent society, not because they had abundance of things, but because they had reliable sufficiency of everything that mattered, and they spent perhaps 3 to 5 hours a day achieving it, leaving the rest of their time for the things that made life worth living. Conversation, play, storytelling, music, the slow pleasures of a social world in which everyone knew everyone, and relationships were the primary currency. Children grew up in these environments held by an entire community of adults. The isolated nuclear family is a very recent invention, historically bizarre in the full span of human experience. The ancestral condition was communal child-rearing, multiple adults sharing responsibility for each child, multiple relationships of care and teaching binding each person to many others from birth. The knowledge transmitted in this way was encyclopedic and took years to absorb. How to read the land and the sky and the water, how to make tools from the materials available, how to process and preserve food, how to treat illness and injury with what the landscape provided, how to manage the complex web of obligations and relationships that held the group together, how to tell the stories that carried all of this knowledge forward, that gave it meaning, that embedded it in a cosmological framework that made sense of everything from the behavior of animals to the nature of death, to the obligations owed to the living and the dead. Because they had a cosmology, a rich, detailed, fully elaborated account of how the world worked and what human beings were, and what their relationship to everything else was. The word we use for this is animism, and it is a word that tends to make modern people condescending in a way that reveals more about our assumptions than about the thing we are describing. Animism is the view that consciousness or something like it is not confined to human beings, that the world is not made of inert objects waiting to be used, but of entities with their own natures and intentions and capacities, that the river is not just water moving downhill, see, that the animal is not just meat, that the rock is not just mineral. This is not confusion. It is not the failure to understand what we understand. It is a different and entirely coherent account of how reality is organized, one that emerges from actually living inside nature rather than observing it from outside. When you spend your entire life dependent on the behavior of animals and plants and weather and water, when everything you eat and drink and wear and use comes directly from a living world that you are in constant relationship with, you develop a set of perceptions that those of us in climate-controlled rooms and supermarkets cannot replicate. The pattern recognition becomes so deep and the relationship so intimate that what looks from outside like supernatural attribution starts to look from inside like accurate description. The shamans were the specialists in this world of living consciousness. Evidence of shamanic practice goes back at least 40,000 years, possibly much further. The therianthropes in the cave paintings, figures that are part human and part animal, represent practitioners who had learned to dissolve the boundary between human consciousness and the consciousness of other beings. The techniques for this were sophisticated and demanding. Rhythmic drumming sustained for hours, bringing participants to altered states through acoustic manipulation of brainwave patterns. Fasting that pushed the body to the edge of its capacity. Sensory deprivation in the deepest and darkest chambers of caves. Plant medicines, selected from a pharmacopoeia assembled over thousands of years of careful experimentation, that produced visionary states of specific character and managed duration. These were not recreational activities. They were technologies for accessing information that was not accessible through ordinary consciousness, for maintaining the relationship between the human community and the other orders of being on which the community depended, for healing, for finding game, for managing the invisible relationships that determined whether the world would be generous or withhold. And at a site called Göbekli Tepe, on a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey, 11,600 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Hunter-gatherers, people who were still living entirely from wild plants and animals, organized themselves to quarry, transport, and erect massive carved stone pillars, some of which weigh 20 tons. Bayes arranging them in circular enclosures, decorated with elaborate relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest monumental architecture yet discovered on Earth. It is 7,000 years older than the pyramids, 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and it was built by nomads. That fact has never stopped being astonishing to archaeologists. You do not expect nomadic hunter-gatherers to build temples. The standard model of human development says that surplus food comes first, then settled living, then specialized labor, then monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe inverts this entirely. The temple came before the settlement. The ritual came before the grain. Perhaps, as some researchers now suggest, it was the demands of the ceremony that drove the first experiments in cultivation, or the need to feed the hundreds of people who gathered at this hilltop for festivals that might have drawn people from a radius of hundreds of kilometers. Perhaps agriculture did not precede religion. Perhaps religion preceded agriculture. The world that produced Göbekli Tepe was changing. The last ice age was ending. The great ice sheets that had locked up vast quantities of water were melting. Sea levels were rising, slowly by the standards of a human lifetime, but catastrophically by the standards of a culture that had been living on the same coastline for generations. The wide, shallow shelves that had been dry land during the Ice Age, the territories where hundreds of thousands of people had been living and building the foundations of their world, were going under. They went under gradually enough that people could flee, but fast enough that within a few generations, the landscapes of childhood were gone, replaced by open water. Those events are recorded, not in texts, but in the oral traditions that survived the displacement, in flood stories told by cultures on every inhabited continent that describe the seas rising and the world being remade. These are not metaphors. They are memories, distorted by time and reshaped by the theological frameworks of each culture that carried them, but rooted in something that actually happened. The water came. For the people standing on the coasts, watching it come, it was the end of everything. For the descendants of the ones who moved to high ground, it became the story of how the world began again. By 12,000 years ago, when the Ice Age was fully over, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. Every environment on Earth had been explored and settled and understood on its own terms. Arctic people in Siberia were living through winters that dropped to 50 below zero in houses engineered from mammoth bone and heated with fires burning that same bone as fuel. Coastal people were reading the Pacific from boats sophisticated enough to cross 90 kilometers of open water. Forest people in equatorial Africa were maintaining pharmacological knowledge systems that took decades to master. Desert people in Australia were reading landscapes that looked to outside eyes like nothing but sand and scrub, and finding in them food and water and medicine and meaning. All of these people were fully human, fully intelligent, fully capable of exactly the same range of thought and feeling and creativity that you are capable of. Their world was not smaller than ours. It was different, and in many of the ways that matter most to actual human experience, it was richer. What ended it was not an improvement. What ended it was a demographic shift. In a few river valleys where the warming climate had made wild grasses extraordinarily productive, people began to notice something. Scatter seeds, and they come back. Stay near the plants instead of following the animals, and you can harvest a larger portion of what grows. Tend the ground around the plants you want, remove what competes with them, and the yield improves. These were not revolutionary insights. They were tiny, practical adjustments made over hundreds of years, each one small enough to be invisible from the inside but accumulating over generations into something that transformed everything. We call it the Neolithic Revolution, but it was not a revolution. It was a drift. And when you look at the skeletal evidence from the populations that made the transition, the picture is not one of improvement. Early farmers were on average shorter than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. They had more tooth decay, more bone disease, more signs of nutritional deficiency, more evidence of repeated infection. They were working harder and eating worse. But farming could support more children per family, and the mathematics of population growth did the rest. The bodies of individual farmers paid a price that the genes of farming populations did not. The surplus that farming created was the hinge on which all of subsequent history turned. Once you can produce more food than your family needs, you create the possibility of people who do not grow food at all. Priests, soldiers, administrators, craftspeople, merchants, kings. The division of labor that makes civilization possible is made possible by agricultural surplus, and the concentration of wealth and power that follows surplus makes hierarchy possible, and hierarchy makes the state possible, and the state makes war on an organized scale possible, and organized war makes it possible to take from others what you have not produced yourself. The same process that gave us philosophy and medicine and mathematics And art also gave us slavery and standing armies, and the grinding poverty of peasant life. These things came together. They are aspects of the same transformation. Writing appeared when the administrative demands of large-scale agricultural societies created a need to keep track of things that could no longer be held in a single person's memory. The first texts are not literature. They are receipts, tax records, inventories of grain and cattle. The accounting precedes the epic. The bureaucrat precedes the poet. By the time Sumerian scribes were pressing wedge-shaped symbols into clay to record the quantities of barley stored in temple granaries 5,000 years ago, most of the human story had already happened, unremarked and unrecorded, in the vast silence of the preceding 300,000 years. That silence is not emptiness. Everything that is most fundamentally human about you was formed in that silence. Your capacity for language and art and cooperation and curiosity. Your need for community and your ability to read faces and your instinct to share when you have abundance. Your sensitivity to fairness and your rage at injustice. Your love of story and your habit of looking up at the night sky and feeling something that does not have a name. These things were not given to you by civilization. They were ancient by the time civilization appeared. They were shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of human beings working out, together and in small groups, what it meant to be the kind of creature we are. The brain you are using to understand these words is not a modern brain in any meaningful sense. It is a brain built for a world that no longer exists. A brain tuned by selection to manage the specific challenges of small group life in variable environments. A brain that is brilliant at reading social relationships and tracking animals across terrain and remembering the productive locations in a landscape, and that finds the demands of modern life often deeply, poorly matched to what it was built for. The loneliness you feel in cities is your hunter-gatherer nervous system, registering the absence of the band it was built to belong to. The anxiety that attaches itself to email inboxes and notifications is your threat detection system misfiring in an environment that has no predators but infinite low-grade stressors. The restlessness that makes sitting at a desk for 8 hours feel like a mild form of torture is the body of a creature designed to walk 10 miles a day, objecting to its confinement. None of this means civilization was a mistake, but it means that the instruction manual for your actual hardware was written 300,000 years ago, and it is worth reading. The evidence from surviving hunter-gatherer communities, the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of the Kalahari, the Aboriginal Australians who maintain their traditional practices into the 20th century, suggests that the emotional and psychological richness of life in those small bands was real and is not easily replicated by material abundance. People who have spent time with these communities consistently report something that surprises them. The people are not miserable. They are not straining toward a civilization they have not yet reached. They are living with a degree of presence and social ease and connection to their world that strikes outside observers as something that has been lost rather than something that has not yet been found. That knowledge is not lost entirely. It is carried in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples around the world, in the ceremonies and the stories and the ecological understanding that have survived colonization and forced assimilation and every other assault that the last few centuries have brought. When a Yolngu elder in Australia describes the relationship between a particular plant and a particular season in terms that sound to Western ears like mythology, but function as precise phenological observation, they are transmitting knowledge accumulated over tens of thousands of years. When an Arctic hunter explains the obligations owed to the animals they kill in terms that Western anthropologists classify as religious, but that function as a sophisticated management protocol for maintaining healthy wildlife populations, they are preserving adaptive wisdom older than any written text. These are not relics. They are the most successful long-term survival strategies our species has ever developed, tested across timescales that make the entire span of written history look like a brief experiment. The story is still being written, and the new chapters keep arriving in ways that nobody predicted. Ancient DNA extracted from a fragment of bone found in a Siberian cave turns out to carry both Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry, revealing a child whose parents belong to two different human species, evidence of a degree of intermingling between archaic populations that nobody had imagined possible. A footprint preserved in ancient mud at a site in North America pushes the date of human arrival on that continent back further than the previous consensus. Underwater survey of the shallow continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age reveals geometrical patterns in the sediment that suggest structures, possible evidence of coastal settlements that went under when the seas rose and have been waiting on the ocean floor for someone to look. The picture is never finished. What we thought we knew 10 years ago about human prehistory is already outdated. What we believe tonight will seem naive in another generation. But the broad outlines are becoming clear enough to stand in. We are not a recent species that appeared and immediately began building civilization. We are a very old species that spent most of our existence living in ways that left almost no trace. And the few traces we have found are enough to tell us that the people who made them were not waiting for history to begin. They were already fully human, already asking the questions, already making the art, already singing the songs and telling the stories and pressing their hands against the stone and saying the thing that has never stopped being said, across every culture and every century and every individual life. I was here. I mattered. Remember me. The stars they looked up at are above you right now. Not metaphorically. The same stars turning in the same patterns was unchanged by the 10,000 years of civilization that have come and gone in the interval. Your ancestors learned to read them as navigation charts and calendars and cosmological maps. They built structures aligned to their rising and setting. They told stories about them that encoded agricultural timing and seasonal migration routes and moral instruction in the same breath, because that is what stories do when they have to carry everything. When you look up on a clear night and feel something that the presence of a screen cannot replicate, you are feeling what they felt. You are the continuation of that feeling. Every human being who has ever stood under those stars and looked up is part of the same conversation. And the conversation began 300,000 years ago with a woman grinding red pigment between two stones in Africa, making something beautiful because something inside her needed to, because she was human, which means she was already everything. Let the world outside grow quiet. Let the long arc of time settle around you, like something you can rest inside of. The hard work, the surviving, the crossing of oceans and the enduring of ice ages, and the carrying of memory through every catastrophe the earth has sent at us. That was done. It was done by people who did not know you and could not imagine you and did it anyway. Generation after generation, across a span of time so vast that our minds cannot hold it. You are what that work produced. You are the latest dream of 100,000 years of human nights. And in your chest, somewhere underneath the noise of the modern world, you carry everything they carried. The curiosity, the grief, the love of beauty, the need to belong, the impulse to press your hand against the stone and leave a mark that says you were here. You are here. Sleep well.